You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property under laws they had no part in making?
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 302 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. And to round up this week of interviews, I have, a friend of the show. I think this is about his fifth or sixth time on the show, Brian Saady. He is a author and a writer. His work can be found at briansaady.com. He has a podcast called Rackets, a book series called Rackets, which is actually, I think, the subject of the first interview that we did together, Brian. So welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Well, today I want to talk about I think a really cool thing that you got to do. You gave a recent talk at the Frontier of Freedom, and it was titled UAE Terrorism and Organized Crime. It was really interesting. You talk about just kind of the organized crime of the UAE, and this show focuses on foreign policy, and the UAE plays a huge role in U.S. foreign policy. So, understanding what goes on inside of the UAE, especially in like their international organized crime, does play an impact on foreign policy, and understanding this angle of what's going on in the Middle East, I think will really help, myself and my audience, gain a better handle on some of like the smaller political moves in the Middle East, and understand why, bigger things like the war in Yemen are unfolding the way they are. So I'm really excited about what we have to talk about here today, Brian. And I guess just start us off by giving us the background information you think, we should have about the UAE and the structure of the UAE, to make everything we're going to talk about today make sense.
Okay. And, just before we started the show, I think you really hit the nail on the head. You basically said that the UAE essentially just completely ignores our U.S. sanctions. In other words, and typically when the average American thinks of the UAE, they tend to know that essentially at the surface level, they really are an ally of ours geopolitically. But I kind of like to sort of explore the real depth of that relationship. And if you know a little bit about my background, I'm a person who focuses mainly on, say, corruption, organized crime, some on terrorism as well. And what I've found, again, and mostly on drug war related issues, and so often you'll see all of these different criminal types, and they essentially have safe haven in the UAE. And it's always something that's really kind of mystified me. Why is this country that's just swimming in oil money, why are they willing to dirty their hands with these type of characters when they really don't need the money? And I can kind of give you just a couple of recent examples that I'd like to point to. For one, there's a guy named Daniel Kinahan. And again, I know most people listening, they're not going to be familiar with that name. But he's essentially head of one of the largest crime organizations in Ireland. And it's a lot of times we use the term crime family. It's sort of, it's facetious. They're not actually blood related. But in this case, they actually are blood related. And that crime family, it's responsible for a number of different murders and, all kinds of violence. And again, they're one of the top drug trafficking organizations in the country. And it's long been known that Daniel Kinahan essentially has safe haven in Dubai. I could also point to another really recent example, such as the Gupta Brothers. They're this family. They were Indian born, and they moved to South Africa roughly a few decades ago, and they built up this vast fortune. And essentially what I could describe the Gupta family as is a group of crony capitalists. And long story short, they fled the country of South Africa recently, and again, they went to Dubai. They found safe haven in Dubai. They're wanted on criminal charges back in South Africa, basically corruption. Essentially, they just sort of bribed their way to the top, siphoned all of that public, not all of it, but whole lot of public money for their own private gain. And again, they're wanted on criminal charges back in South Africa. And there's really just sort of this perfect political cartoon that I came across, and it shows essentially like a UAE official accepting this big bag of bribe money. And he's saying, well, now you get to be the Minister of Tourism, Mr. Gupta. So to kind of explain, in my opinion, why you have this dynamic occurring, you kind of need to know a little bit more about the past of the UAE. Because the UAE wasn't always just swimming in oil money. The UAE, it declared independence back in 1971. And I'd really like to you're seeing this trend where I keep mentioning Dubai. There's 7 different emirates, but really where most of this connection with criminality, most of it's really based in Dubai. And you have to know a little bit more about who is essentially the founder of modern day Dubai. His name was Sheikh Rashid. And again, back when they were directly linked with Britain there, back in the 1950s, Sheikh Rashid, he essentially acknowledged in a private meeting that the city sustained itself on, quote, uncertain smuggling. In other words, Dubai was known, and still pretty much is known, as this sort of smuggling haven. And it's not, when you hear of smuggling, probably the first thing that you're thinking of is drugs. But it's not just drugs that have really flown through that region. Everything from gold to all kinds of just different counterfeit goods and all types of just different illegal trade has flowed through the city. And in fact, Sheikh Rashid, he was actually listed as one of the most wanted smugglers by the former Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. Now, when I mention that, there's no actual real evidence that he himself was a smuggler. But if you look at the circumstantial evidence, it's, in my opinion, pretty clear that there was a lot of corruption, direct corruption, going on. And one of my most prescient examples I can point to is back in 1956, there was this major drug bust in Dubai. And Sheikh Rashid actually fired the customs officials who made the arrest. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of background, because again, the country wasn't very wealthy in those days back in the 1950s. The oil boom, it really happened in the 1970s. So much like a lot of, say, these offshore companies, where you're struggling to get this foreign capital into your country, they just sort of look the other way at criminality in order to get the flow of finances through your country. But again, and there's really no real excuse for it either way, but you can kind of understand that when you have that background. But again, the problem is the country is just drowning in oil money, so there's really no need for this kind of connection with organized crime and terrorists. There's just a number. Everything from drug traffickers, arms traffickers, nuclear proliferators. You name it. We're going to talk about some of these different examples over the course of this podcast today. But again, in other words, not much has really changed in Dubai from the past to the present.
All right, so yeah, let's look at some of those examples. One that you don't think of is especially American is just Indian organized crime. And so apparently, you bring up this story and you say something that I had no idea, which is that Dubai is like the gold trading capital of the world here. And then you have some issues with smuggling in India and terrorist bombing there. So break that all down for us.
Sure. So first, you probably need to know a little bit more about India. There's this massive black market for gold smuggling in their country for a couple of reasons. For one, there's very high demand for gold in their country for a number of religious and cultural reasons. But there's also a black market because the government has very high tariffs on the good. So it sort of created this black market for smugglers. And just to give you an idea how big this black market is, there was this Interpol study once that estimated that around $4 billion worth of gold is smuggled into the country every year. And I would really point to there's a lot of people making money from that illegal trade, but there's really one individual at the top of that illegal hierarchy. His name is Dawood Ibrahim. And you'll see references to him in pop culture. A number of different shows and stuff will reference him without saying his name. But his organization is loosely known as D Company. And again, in some of these pop culture references, they'll use names that are very similar to that to sort of reference him without making a direct reference. But yeah, he actually fled. I mean, he built up this criminal empire in India that's worth around $250 million. I mean, everything. It's not just gold smuggling. It's drugs, gambling, prostitution, extortion, robbery. I mean, just a full diverse array of a criminal portfolio, you could say. And eventually he had to flee India. But he was still running his organization, still is today. And he found safe haven in Dubai. And really, it wasn't until the early 90s until, again, he's got this massive criminal mastermind who's living within the borders of Dubai. He's wanted on all kinds of criminal charges, but the UAE government just looked the other way. And that was until there was this one incident. And what I'm referring to is there was a terrorist attack in Mumbai back in March of 1993. Around 250 people were killed and another 700 people were injured. And essentially it was just like a series of attacks. They attacked the Bombay Stock Exchange. There was just a series of bombings all across over the course of that day. And at that point, when it was just organized crime, the UAE essentially was willing to look the other way. But at that point, he was forced out of the country. So Dawood Ibrahim, he fled to Pakistan, where today his whereabouts are known. He has essentially the protection of the ISI. And he's arguably just as powerful today. He's still involved in a number of very high profile criminal cases. For example, Al Jazeera did a story on his organization. I think it was like late last year where they were talking about fixing matches. Essentially, I think it was cricket matches. It's again kind of one of the things that I like to talk about, how when you create more of these black markets, best case scenario, you're just bringing criminal types into the fold. And then worst case scenario, you're actually bringing sort of terrorist type individuals, and that's say from drugs and gambling of that sort. But you would think that, well, they kicked him out of the country, so they did their due diligence. Well, that's really not really the case. One of the top financial operators of D Company is a guy who's nicknamed Farouk Takla. And he was wanted in relation to that terrorist attack of 1993. He was wanted by Interpol as far back as 1995. And again, his whereabouts were known there in Dubai as well. But he wasn't actually extradited back to India to face criminal charges for that terrorist attack until actually last year. So, I mean, it's really one of those perfect examples of, there's a term in academia where they refer to the crime terror nexus. And we're starting to see it a lot more, with various terrorist organizations, that it's not just funding from some sort of benevolent terrorist mastermind. In a lot of cases, they're funding their terror from different forms of crime. In some cases, it's drugs. There was that recent attack there in Kenya by the group Al-Shabaab, and they make their funds from a lot of different forms of crime. They also have benevolent financiers. They are linked with Al-Qaeda. There are some reports, though, that they do make money from extorting the drug trade. Essentially, they make a lot of money from extortion, but sort of essentially any sort of financial transaction or flow that goes through their country, they tend to make money from extorting that, and that does include the drug trade as well. And again, it kind of gets back to one of the main points that I like to talk about with, if we can end the drug war, we can have a fairly sizable impact on terrorism.
That is a fantastic point, because so much of the war on terrorism is because these groups are able to get financing, and if you cut off a cash flow, you think it'd be worth it. As much as we do to fight the war on terror? This would be an easy one. And, we both have a little bit more of a, end prohibition position on the war on drugs as well. So that'd be great. I do want to move into talking about AQ Khan, who certainly has had a huge impact on, Middle East and South Asian, world affairs. And so what ties does he have to UAE criminality?
Yeah, actually one point, and I did forget to mention it, and it's very prescient, because I was kind of talking a little bit more about the past as far as with Dawood Ibrahim, and I'll get to the AQ Khan in a second, but he does have connections with the Taliban and their drug trade. He's known to be, one of the main couriers that's pushing drugs throughout the world and directly from the source there. So it's not just, past examples. So yeah, you mentioned the guy AQ Khan, that's Abdul Qadir Khan. He's essentially really the founder of Pakistan's nuclear, industry. And, basically, he had a very lucrative side business where he would sell different nuclear information and materials to different sanctioned and hostile nations, namely Libya, North Korea, and Iran. And it kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier with the gold trade. And you mentioned it exactly. Dubai is essentially really the gold trading center of the world. So when when Khan was doing all of these different types of side deals, and it's estimated that he made as much as $400 million, from this illegal trade. Time in and time out, what he would do is he would often even negotiate the deals there in Dubai. But what he would do is he would set up a front company. After the deal's over, he'd close out that company. And then he would launder the money through the gold market. And that gold industry, there are a number of issues with regulating and monitoring it. And I know that that's kind of a red flag word with a largely libertarian audience, but I do just kind of want to point out, some of it. There was, a recent report by a group called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And essentially what they found is even though so much of this gold, it's essentially the epicenter of the world's gold trade there in Dubai, there's very little, they do have regulations on the book, but essentially they just completely lack any sort of teeth. So in other words, there's no real accounting for the origin of the gold that's entering the country. And there was really an excellent report recently in the American Conservative. I'm forgetting who wrote it. I'd love to give credit. But sort of really pointing to that and kind of tying back to what we were talking about originally with the whole war in Yemen. And it has to do with Sudan, because Sudan has a ton of gold resources. And for many years, this was a sanctioned country. The sanctions were lifted early 2017, early part of the Trump administration for no real, I haven't really seen any real improvement as far as like human rights or democracy in Sudan. But again, those sanctions were lifted. But for many years, again, it was sort of known that they were really flaunting any of those types of sanctions. And Dubai, again, was really the beginning source of that laundering. And a lot of that funding, as far as Sudan's end, came through the gold market of Dubai. So it's nice to invite all of this commerce into your country, but there does have to be some sort of common sense overview that doesn't allow illicit trade, I guess is essentially my point.
Yeah, so I'll say we'll link to the American Conservative article in the show notes page. That way, whoever wrote it could get credit for it. Sure, and yeah. Just to add there that right now there are some protests going on in Sudan against the dictator of that country, Bashar. And, there's pretty brutal repression of them. You're seeing a lot of tear gas and rubber bullets, less lethal aid, less lethal, means of, stopping people, not just, let people say it's not lethal at all. These are lethal weapons still. And, also actually killing, I believe, over 40 people now in those protest suppressions going on in Sudan. So, yeah, definitely no improvement in their human rights record there.
No.
Well, I want to talk about this because I think it's a very interesting kind of thread of the things we talked about so far, and that's the ties between organized crime and terrorism and how one kind of bleeds into the other. And, especially what I think you've perfectly focused on already, which is, how creating a prohibition on drugs creates a situation where you have, the smuggling that could go to the organized crime and then that might filter to the terrorist groups anyways.
Right. Yeah, back in the 80s, there was a term that sort of got popularized by a lot of the neocons, and they like to use the term narco-terrorists. And I've always tried to sort of counter their argument. Their argument was, well, since a lot of these terrorist organizations, and they were really pointing to a lot of these sort of communist rebel groups in South America, such as the FARC in Colombia, the Shining Path in Peru. And again, these are bona fide terrorist organizations responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. And the drug trade definitely helped them. So again, that phrase was actually coined by a former president of Peru. But then again, the U.S. neocons really latched onto it. So it was sort of part of the propaganda of the drug war in the 80s. And it was fairly effective. But again, my point has always been, there's so many of these types of examples of these terrorist groups that get their funding via the prohibition of the drug war. And obviously the drug war hasn't been effective. Heck, we've got public enemy number one, El Chapo in criminal court in New York, and seemingly nothing has changed. So again, the war on drugs is a failure, yet we still indirectly enable these different types of terrorist organizations by creating the prohibition. And a lot of times it's not just prohibition, it's really sort of these gray markets. And again, it comes, I think, I guess you could say sort of with good intentions. But a lot of times, the cigarette market, the taxes are so high that it actually creates this gray market for bootleg cigarettes. I mentioned again, South America. That's where you have a real problem with that. Actually, the former president of Paraguay was actually the owner of one of the main companies for exporting these illegal cigarettes, and it's really helped the drug trade, and also actually helped Hezbollah, which actually has a presence there in Paraguay as well. But to kind of tie it back to the UAE, the UAE is really one of the top sources for either, say, counterfeit or illegal cigarettes. I don't remember the exact number. Let me check my notes real quick. Yeah, the European Commission's Tax and Customs Union, they actually found one year that 56% of the illegal cigarettes seized in Europe were made in the UAE. And again, a lot of times it's those free trade zones that's really the conduit of that illegal trade. So again, most of that, as far as Europe, those aren't really the narco terrorists or so that we were discussing. They were more mainline organized crime. But again, let's try not to fund organized crime if we can. But really, and really one of the most severe examples, I'd like to point to Turkey. There's an estimated, annually $1 billion black market for illegal cigarettes in Turkey. And I mentioned this when we were doing that presentation up there in DC. And again, I kind of like to make a little corny joke that I'm not trying to elicit a tear for the Erdogan regime, but I do want to point out that this black market has actually funded terrorism. So what happens is there's this Marxist terrorist organization known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and essentially most of their attacks are centered there in Turkey. And basically, what happens is, in order to smuggle those cigarettes into Turkey, you got to pay them protection money. So there's this massive, $1 billion black market, and really nobody's profiting more from it than an actual terrorist organization. So the actual source for most of those cigarettes, again, you can point back to the UAE. And it's produced by a company called Bulgar Tabak. This was actually a formerly state-owned tobacco company of Bulgaria. It's since been privatized, and it's owned by through these different shell corporations. The majority shareholder is essentially this sort of media oligarch back in Bulgaria. His name's I can't pronounce the name correctly, but Delyan Pivsky is my best attempt at it. But again, it all goes back to Dubai because, again, the main point as far as the smuggling route is Dubai. So by just looking the other way at what seems like not that big of a deal of these illegal cigarettes, given it with a wink and a nudge, in the end, you are actually funding terrorism. And again, we can think, well, what's the harm in these illegal cigarettes? I mean, we can point to it in our own country. I don't know if you remember an example. Years ago, and I think I wish I could remember how long ago, it was probably about 15 years ago, there was this very small cell of Hezbollah. I think they were based in Virginia. And what they would do is they would buy the cigarettes dirt cheap in North Carolina or South Carolina, I don't remember, and then they would go smuggle them up into Michigan and I believe in New York, sell it for this huge markup because there's this gray market or black market for bootleg cigarettes there, take the profits and then ship it back to Hezbollah. So again, I guess really the main point I'm trying to talk about is that, again, sometimes it's not just the black markets, but these essentially gray markets can also then fund terrorism as well.
So the question I have to ask you now is, the PKK is labeled a terrorist organization by the United States. So I guess how the hell do they get away with flaunting U.S. sanctions like this? You would think the U.S. should be cracking down on the UAE. And, we've talked about connections with, the Taliban or, other dictators around the world. Certainly there were sanctions on Sudan for a long time. How does the UAE get away with all this?
And again, this will be more of my opinion.
Right.
But I think that, well, first of all, as we know, there's a whole lot of hypocrisy with U.S. foreign and domestic policy. But I do think that a lot of it just comes down to the U.S. being hungry to have an ally in the Middle East. On paper, they really are our ally, as far as wars related. I think another factor is that we really have our own issues here, not just sort of with the sanctions. I've sort of pointed out how the UAE essentially is this money laundering hub for, say, terrorists and nuclear proliferators, arms traffickers, you name it. But you gotta, we have our own issues here in the U.S. I think a pretty good example, there was, it didn't get reported that well, but I forget what the exact address is, but there was this building actually on Park Avenue in Manhattan, New York, that was purchased through a U.S. shell corporation, which a few years ago they discovered was actually owned by the Iranian government, all while the Iranian government was sanctioned. So we have a lot of secrecy here with our bank laws, and we've never really taken our own sanctions that seriously. We put a lot of pressure on these other countries, but when it can actually hurt or harm our own business interests, we've been softer than anybody. Really one of the perfect examples is the company HSBC. Now again, that's a UK bank, but they do a lot of business here in the US. I mean, I think one of the second largest financial institution in the world. And, they were fined, I forget, 1 point something billion a few years ago. But nobody actually went to prison. And this was on a money laundering related charge where they were the top choices for Colombian cartels, Mexican drug cartels, but they were also just openly flaunting sanctions with Sudan, Iran, Cuba. Just a laundry list. But at the end of the day, these were these bankers who have a lot of political influence, and nobody actually went to prison. And one of the other things I'd like to point out is because there's been, various recent reports of the UAE as far as the real estate market being a major money laundering hub. I think, yeah, it was the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. So what happened was there was essentially this report, and I kind of liken it to the Panama Papers, where they received leaked property information, and they found that over $100 million worth of luxury real estate in Dubai was owned by a whole host of different sanctioned individuals, and that included a major source of the precursor chemical for meth for the Mexican cartels. A group of Syrian businessmen who you could really best describe as basically war profiteers. One of the top crime bosses of Kyrgyzstan, who's essentially tied in there with the Russian organized crime. And I mean, there's a lot also Russian organized crime members who are mentioned in this report. Altaf Kanani, who's essentially one of the top money launderers in the world for different, I mean, you name it, drug traffickers, terrorists, you name it. And again, many of the people within his organization operate there within Dubai. So the point I'm trying to make here is, although we've been sort of pointing this finger at the UAE, and deservedly so, we need to point the finger also at our own country. And by that, I'm referring to, there was this program that the U.S. Treasury implemented, I think it was back in 2016. And the reason, what it is, here in the U.S., you can actually buy property here through a shell corporation where nobody knows who actually owns the company. So if you think about that, say you could go park $1 million in some luxury property, that would be a very attractive type of venture, say if you were a corrupt foreign official or an organized crime member, you know, a drug cartel, et cetera, to where you could just park your money anonymously here in the U.S. in a very safe country where likely, you know, the government isn't known as really sort of a kleptocracy. So your money would be safe. So what happened was back in 2016, the Treasury Department started to implement these regulations, and they said that in certain cities, because the real estate market is only really big in a certain number of cities, and such as San Francisco, LA, New York, Miami. And what they did, just to give you an example from Miami, I don't remember the threshold off the top of my head, but I think if the property was $500,000 or more, you could still buy the property through a corporation, but we had to know who the beneficial owner was. And what happened was within a year, 95% of those transactions were gone. So it just kind of gives you one little glimmer into the fact that, yes, our country also has major issues with money laundering and enabling crime and corruption. And I mean, I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but we can also point to the President of the United States here. Because in many ways, money, as far as money laundering is concerned, the real estate market was essentially an afterthought. But now with Donald Trump being elected, a lot of people are starting to point to all these different investigations where they see how his properties essentially have been hubs for laundering money. That includes his property the property in which he licenses his name down there in Panama, where that was a hub for the Colombian cartels and Russian organized crime. And you can just point to a list of different properties as well in which essentially his real estate has been a source of money laundering. So, I mean, this goes all the way up to the President of the United States. So in my very long-winded way of explaining this, it's really hard, in my opinion, for us to crack down in a credible manner on any of this type of stuff until we clean up our own house.
Well, absolutely, and I don't think you would have any problems convincing my audience that the United States is some sort of kleptocracy. I mean, when you look at between, you know, having now Trump, who, you know, as you're identifying there, may have, you know, been involved in some money laundering stuff. You know, we've talked in the past on the show about, you know, Hillary Clinton having political influence and, you know, getting $1 million donations to the Clinton Foundation from these Gulf states. And so certainly everybody on the, you know, political inside is buying into it somehow. And, you know, it's not surprising how you wind up with policies, I guess, you know, thinking about what you're talking about, the banking interests and their influence over American policy and, you know, how the UAE is able to, by political influence in the United States, even by supporting different think tanks. They give huge donations, they push papers, and they end up with, I believe, the Saudis have a huge stake in Twitter, like 5% or something. And so they end up with influence over, major American social media and stuff like that. These countries have a lot of influence in our country. And when your politicians are as corrupt as ours, it's no surprise they turn the other way and let this happen. There is one other, aspect of the, kind of UAE, organized crime that you brought up in, your presentation. That was the Hawala system. And I think this is probably important to understanding kind of how these kind of transactions happen around the Middle East, and just something that's probably pretty important to kind of Muslim culture to understand. So if you want to break that down a little bit for us, I really appreciate it.
Sure. I'd like to talk about Hawala, but you actually sparked something that I wanted to comment upon as well. You're talking about just their actual foreign influence. And I think really one of the better examples is, and I can't remember the exact type of legislation, but essentially the UAE had to go through our system and have, to where they could actually start developing their own nuclear energy. Again, this is a country flooded with oil money, but they have so much commerce there that they do there is a need for nuclear energy. But to go through that process, you have to, again, I can't remember the exact legislation, but at the time, this was a concern in Congress because this stuff that we're talking about here really is an open secret. And when they started to examine a lot of this stuff, well, gee, there's a lot of red flags here. In fact, before they actually got this legislation passed, there were a number of different Dubai-based companies that were selling, I can't remember if it was nuclear material or nuclear info, or maybe both, to Iran while Iran was sanctioned. So again, there were all these different types of red flags, but ultimately the UAE did win that approval. And it kind of gets back to what you're talking about, how money talks, and they know how to pay for the right lobbyists, the right PR people. They put a lot of money into our system. And at the end of the day, it is far from a perfect system. And those conflicts of interest tend to win out. Not always, but the money influence does tend to win out. But to get back to the question that you asked, the Hawala system. Now, I'll bet that most of the people listening have never even heard of that term, or maybe you'll hear of it every now and again. You watch some of these crime and terrorism TV shows. But now you can know what they're talking about. So Hawala, I would like to liken it sort of to like a Middle Eastern form of Western Union. Hawala is very much ingrained in Middle Eastern culture. Some countries more than others. In large part because a lot of these countries don't really have strong banking systems. And there are a lot of, I would guess you would say, sort of like foreign workers working in different countries, and they send remittances back home. So in other words, there's this vast demand for sending money from country to country and across, even domestically. So what they'll do, and this is a system that's been around for just hundreds of years, and it just really hasn't stopped, where there are essentially what you call these Hawala dealers. You go into a storefront, and I could go into a storefront in Dubai, and I could send money to Afghanistan or the reverse, or all across the world. And there are also Hawala dealers here in the U.S. A lot of foreign workers, again, who send money back home. And for the most part, for the vast majority of the money that's flowing through this system, it's not illicit money. This is, just good, honest, hard-earned wages that are sent among different people. But there are weaknesses to this system, because when you send the money, first of all, that Hawala dealer, they're not asking you for ID. They don't want your information. And basically all you need is they'll give you a password for the transaction. And the person who's going to pick up the money on the other end, they need the password. So it's this completely anonymous source of money that's flowing throughout the Middle East and other parts of the world as well. And unfortunately, there are examples where this system has helped finance terrorism. And one of the prime examples I can point to is a guy who I mentioned earlier in connection with Dawood Ibrahim and D Company. I mentioned a guy called Farouk Takla. He was essentially one of the main financial operators of D Company. And again, for many years, he was based there in Dubai. And long story short, a lot of his financial flow had to do with the Hawala system. So again, you have this essentially completely unregulated form of financial flow. And in the vast majority of cases, it is legal and honest commerce, but in some cases, this money is funding terrorism. So it brings up an interesting question of how do you deal with this system? The UAE has made some progress with it. I don't want to totally bash their reputation. They've tried to make them at least sort of register with the government. And in some instances, they have caught people who were, using this system to send to various sanctioned or criminal organizations. But there still is, just a lot of improvement that needs to be made. Part of it, if you're noticing that trend, like again, I've been mentioning, there's these different terrorist attacks that have happened in India. Now, India, on the other hand, has taken a very hardline stance against the Hawala system. They actually ban it in their country, but time and time again, there have been many terrorist attacks in India, and many times Hawala really was the source of the funding. So in my eyes, there really is no real clear answer. In my personal opinion, I think that governments really shouldn't completely ban it the way that India does. I think that they should try to draw these dealers into the system and have some sort of regulation or some level of overview to try to create some level of transparency so that you can, investigate and try to prevent these terrorist attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I could offer up the libertarian solution of just, end the wars in the Middle East and end the war on drugs. And, you would dry up a lot of the money and a lot of the main drivers of people to terrorism. Now,
Right.
Obviously, there are situations like in Turkey and India where you have Erdogan who suppresses the Kurdish minority there, and you now have a situation where there's terrorism. And so, the terrorism is a real problem. The Turkish government's actions are a real problem. Same thing in India. You have a massive, I think like the second most populous Muslim country in the world is India with like 100-something, million Muslims. Yet, there's still a, 10% minority in the country because the population is so huge, right? And so they face some pretty severe repression from the Indian government, particularly up in the Kashmir region. And so, even if the United States ends our war on terror, you're still going to have terrorism in the world because you're going to have, this level of oppression. However, you would think that a lot of the money would dry up since, the U.S. is the world empire and we're the ones waging seven wars right now and, all across the Middle East and North Africa. And it would really, you can make a huge dent in it by doing that and then, ending the drug war. And especially for the U.S. to end the drug war since, I think, as far as consumers of drugs, it's huge, but just in the, that we control the world financial system. And if we cut off the drug flow, then I think that can make a real difference. Before we wrap up here, I did want to ask you, about Colombia and just for an update since the last show. I think, one of the big question marks I had moving forward, in Colombia was that we had a new leader in the country, Ivan Duque, I believe, and he seemed a little bit more hostile to the FARC, and they were in the middle of a disarmament process and moving towards a political party. So I guess, what's unfolded there? Are we still looking good in Colombia towards peace, or is it moving in the other direction?
Let me address it. But actually, again, you sparked another thought, and I really agree quite a bit with what you had to say there. Essentially, what you're saying, it's sort of that analogy of don't treat the symptoms, treat the cause, because essentially Hawala really is the symptom. You're talking about let's deal with the underlying issue, and I fully agree with that. But yeah, to get back to your question about Colombia, just as sort of a recap, we had in Colombia there was a little bit more of a moderate leader who actually helped to create this peace deal back in 2016 there. Ivan Duque is very hard right, and openly a critic of the peace deal. And there was a lot of support for that. There's a lot of sentiment. This is a very, very divisive issue in Colombia. That deal passed with a razor thin margin. And again, many of these members of the FARC are bona fide terrorists. So a lot of your average Colombian, they're not exactly jumping with joy at the thought of these people getting government aid and protection, etc. So, but at the same time, you do have to try to come to some sort of solution to stop the violence. But let's, with the previous president, they signed this peace deal, and there were a lot of concessions that were supposed to go to the FARC, i.e. the main one being essentially security. And he really set the bar pretty low, because on paper you write this deal and there were a lot of promises on the part of the Colombian government, but really most of them really weren't met. So again, he set this really low bar for the incoming president. So the incoming president, Duque, again, very verbal, a strong verbal critic of the peace deal. And my real fear was that he was going to scrap it. And in many ways, he's openly said that he would. But he really hasn't done anything to really change the status quo, to move further away. In my opinion, he really hasn't done anything worse. But again, it's a very low bar that we're referring to here. Since the peace deal, I think the last figure I saw, 85 different members of the FARC have been murdered. So the vast majority of the FARC have, handed down their weapons. They've really left the rebel state, and they're really trying to become members of society. But that's not referring to everybody. There was a group of dissidents, as they like to call them. Initially, the government estimated that number was around 1,200. So these people, they just haven't stopped at all. And in many ways, they weren't really ideologically a Marxist rebel. I think somewhat they were tied to that, but really I think that they were really drawn into the power of being in this group and really the money that comes along with it from the drug trade. And again, the FARC wasn't only involved in the drug trade. Essentially, there's this massive market for illegal gold, and illegal coltan mining. Coltan is the mineral it's a really important mineral. It goes with cell phones and computers. It really just kind of keeps our whole modern technological world flowing. And there's not a lot of countries in the world where that mineral is present. So they will, they're involved in the extortion of those different groups. And what's happened is that the number of dissidents has really expanded quite a bit. There was a recent government report where they think that there's as many as 3,000 dissidents. And here's the problem. They're not just committing this violence within Colombia. They've really expanded. They've gone into Ecuador. They were responsible for a pretty high profile and fairly well publicized murder of some different Ecuadorian journalists. But more importantly, they've expanded into Venezuela, where there's evidence of corruption, and there's already that sort of ideological tie, that sort of anti-American, extreme socialist, Marxist connection there. And it was already, we talked about it in a previous podcast, where it's fairly well known that the high level military officials within the Venezuelan government were closely linked with the FARC and their drug trafficking efforts. Because again, Venezuela has also been a major hub for transporting the cocaine out of the country. So with now some of these dissidents moving into Venezuela, a country that's got all kinds of problems to begin with, you now have, and they've already had problems with criminal organizations, you now have this extra layer of extreme criminal drug trafficker, or whatever label you want to use, moving into their country. But just to kind of wrap up the original question, in my opinion, it's really sort of stayed the same as far as the peace deal, as far as the Colombian government. But again, very low bar. But unfortunately, the situation on the ground, in my opinion, has worsened. And it gets back to, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but again, it gets back to these black markets. When you have these black markets in place, best case scenario, you'll have criminal types who will take over in worst case scenario, borderline militant or terrorist types, taking over these black markets.
All right. Well, a fantastic way to end it. And, I've had you on the show, I think, every couple months for the past year. So I'll hopefully at least keep that up. I know there's a whole bunch of stuff right now going on in, especially Central and South America that I'm very fascinated about. And, we'll probably have you on in the future to talk about, but for now, tell people where they can find your work until you're on the show again. And if you want to send them anywhere else, do it here.
Sure. You can go to my website. That's Brian Saady. I'll spell my name Brian. Last name is S like Sam, A like Apple, D like dog, Y like yellow.com. My different social medias, you can follow me as well. Same thing. It's just my name. If you're interested in any of my work, I would point to something that we've sort of been talking about here. I have a book series called Rackets. It's in regards to the legalization of drugs, gambling, and the decriminalization of prostitution. So it ties into a lot of the subject matter that we discussed today. And I think it would be an excellent read for people if you found any of this interesting.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much. Look forward to it.